Welcome to the Published Author Podcast, where we help entrepreneurs learn how to write a book and leverage it to grow their business and make an impact. I'm your host, Josh Steimle. Today, my guest is John Meese. John is an economist turned entrepreneur on a mission to eradicate generational poverty by helping entrepreneurs create thriving businesses. John is the author of the new book, Survive and Thrive: How to Build a Profitable Business in Any Economy, including this one. John is also the CEO of Cowork Inc., co-founder of Notable, and host of the Thrive School podcast. John, welcome to the show.
Josh, thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to be here.
So give us a little bit more background on yourself, John. Who are you? What do you do? Who do you do it for?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, my passion is really serving entrepreneurs and helping entrepreneurs create thriving businesses. But it comes from this deep held belief that if we want to eradicate generational poverty, which I do, then entrepreneurship is the best way to do that. And what I mean by generational poverty is not just the fact that there are some poor people in the world, but there are lots of poor people in the world. And that's, of course, a horrible thing. But what I mean is the cycle of where you get family systems that get caught in passing poverty on from one generation to the next, much less the ultra wealthy might pass wealth on from one family to the next. And I come from one of these family lines of where just bad decision after bad decision after bad decision when it comes to money and wealth, meaning that everybody in my family, as far back as I know, is really just kind of subsisted, just kind of got by. And so I'm a first generation college student. So the idea was like that I'm the, holy grail who's going to go out there. I'm going to go to college and I'm going to get this piece of paper that's going to dramatically change our family's trajectory. And I did that. I got a couple pieces of paper that say that I know some things, and it didn't really change much. And, of course, I'm part of this generation. I'm 30. So I'm part of this millennial generation that was kind of part of this pivot in what was the value of a college degree, and especially a bachelor's, and where that's useful or not. But I got really frustrated because I'd spent, of course, a lot of money and then years of time just devoted to this goal that didn't dramatically pay out the way that I hoped it would from my background. And I'm the first person in my family to ever get a college degree, so we didn't really know, what to expect. But as I started to really break down from my economics degree, and I worked for an economics research lab and started to really study entrepreneurship, I got excited about the fact that the reality is you don't actually need a degree or investors or a massive business plan to build a successful business. All you really need at its core is you need to find real people who have a real problem that you can create a real solution to. And if you could do those three things, right? Identify the real people who have a real problem that they're aware of and actively trying to solve, and create a real solution to that problem, you can create a thriving business. And no one asks where you got your degree or how many investors you have or how big your team is, because you're solving their problem. And so I got fired up about that. And so I've kind of made it my personal mission to be not only a poster child for entrepreneurship myself as a serial entrepreneur, but also to help other entrepreneurs build thriving businesses that support their life and make the world a better place. So that's a little bit about me.
That's great. So tell us about your businesses,
Sure.
Cowork and Notable. What are these businesses? How did you start them? Why did you start them?
Yeah. So, my first business is not listed in that bio because it's kind of like a behind the scenes thing, is Meese Works, which is just a name that's on invoices. You won't see that anywhere else. But that's, my first business was blogging and podcasting and selling online courses and making a full-time living doing that. And I, along the way, I partnered with another entrepreneur named Thomas McGee, who is a designer and developer. And we created a series of WordPress themes for content creators who want to, have a blog or have a podcast or have a YouTube channel and publish that on their website where they can build an email list and launch a membership site and have all that kind of stuff. And so we now have one flagship product over there. That's Notable, that company. And so we've got a product called Notable Press, which is what I use on my own website, but it's really designed for the new multimedia world of having potentially all three: a blog, a podcast, a YouTube channel, all really positioned in one place in a way that grows your email list and also has membership capability built in. So Notable was kind of a gradual, it was a natural, it's a different company, but it was a natural evolution of that first company, and where I was just teaching training to say, but you also need these tools. And then Cowork Inc. is actually my newest company. And so that was something where I thought it was a good idea in January of 2020 to get into the co-working space business. And so on January 15th, 2020, I opened my first co-working space, Entrepreneur Center. And it's really designed to be a an entrepreneur center first, a co-working space second. And that's in Columbia, Tennessee. It's actually where I'm talking to you from right now, is in my office at the co-working space. 58 days later, this little thing called COVID-19 came along, and we were shut down by executive order for 48 days straight. So we've been open for 58 days, closed for 48 days. Not a strong start to that business. So my story is not without its own roadblocks. But I really used that time to lock myself in a room and write Survive and Thrive, actually the first draft of that book, because I recognized right away that what was happening was a health crisis, but it was also a mental health crisis. And that's something that I think will take a long time to unpack, but I'm unqualified to help with. But it was also an economic crisis. And the fact that, now it looks like there were an extra 200,000 businesses in the US that were permanently closed in 2020 that didn't have to be, because of the COVID restrictions, because of the changing economy, many, many reasons. And I think that's a tragedy, but it's also at a time when we're at an all-time low of new business startups in the US and across the world. And so I said, well, I want to create a how-to guide that'll help solve that. And so I took my own experience, but I also interviewed a few dozen of my, and we could talk about the process behind this, but the short version is I interviewed a few dozen of my mentors and included their insights in the book as well. And that was kind of how I spent the lockdown. Some people got into Tiger King. I wrote a book. But now that business has grown. So since the lockdowns lifted, the co-working space, our first location is back open. It's up and running. It's growing, which is good. We're now talking about multiple co-working spaces, but that's also now we're rolling out this training arm of that business because, again, the co-working space is just a piece of that. It's all about serving entrepreneurs. So we're rolling out a new membership site called Thrive School Pro, a new conference in October that's called Built to Thrive Live, which we haven't officially announced yet, but here you go. And then, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of things going on, but it all comes back to the core of serving entrepreneurs.
That's fantastic. Entrepreneurship will save the world.
Amen.
So I'm amazed that you were able to survive COVID with a co-work space, especially since you hadn't really built up a base. And then, of course, you lose everybody that you had as a customer. How were you able to bounce back from that and make it through that tough time?
Well, that's kind of one of the points of the book, right? It's called Survive and Thrive, right? Because you have to survive first, which is what you're asking about, which was a real question. It was like, do we just close it? I mean, but the reality was we had spent 3 months and a lot of money building out the space, and we had a big grand opening, lots of local attention, influx of members, whole teams joining. It was great. It was exciting. And then when we closed, not so exciting. In fact, on the phone with my attorney going through the executive order in Tennessee line by line saying like, there's no way this applies to us, right? He's like, yeah, it applies to you. So that was not fun. So for those 48 days that we were closed, we had zero revenue in the business. Some co-working spaces chose to continue, much like many gyms did, to continue to charge their members and say like, well, for us to stay open, we've got to keep charging you even though you can't access the space. But I didn't feel good about that because I felt like, well, the problem we're solving for these customers is to give them an inspiring professional workspace that we can't give them right now. That's not my fault, but it's also not their fault. So I didn't charge customers for a day we were closed. For people that already paid, we basically gave them credit towards their future membership. And when we reopened, about half our members said, I'm not ready to come back, and canceled. So yeah, that was a rough start. That was a very rough start to that business. What I then looked at was, and I talk about this in my book, there's in every crisis, there's a right side and a wrong side. And so I looked around and said, okay, the co-working side of our business is on the wrong side of this crisis, right? Because going out there and saying, hey, you want to leave your house and come work next to other people in April or May or June of 2020 was insane. And it would have been a waste of effort. We would have lost credibility with people. And so we said, okay, we're still in business. We're still here. We're still open, but we're going to downshift on the co-working side and then upshift on the training side because that's something we can still do. So I personally took on a few clients where I was a fractional CMO to do some consulting for their companies. But I also wrote this book and built out our new membership site. And then also on the notable, because I had multiple companies, I also had the luxury of focusing more on the software company and saying, look, that's actually blowing up right now. Let's focus on that a little bit. And so we downshifted with the co-working space. So it's only really the last couple of months where we've seen such an incredible growth, where now we're running ad campaigns. Now we're getting people coming in or calling almost every day to join the co-working space. But the offerings also shifted because when we opened, we had a full-time on-site community manager. That did not last. We had to let that staff member go. I mean, that's just business, right? I mean, it's just, there's not enough demand to support that role. But along the way, we discovered that there were only a handful of co-working spaces in the US that are really pushing the limits of what you could do in an automated 24/7 co-working space without full-time staff on site. And so we shifted our business model. That's gone really well. And now it makes it a lot easier and cheaper for us to talk about having 5 or 10 or 20 co-working spaces, because we're not talking about having 20 full-time employees, one in each of those spaces. So yeah, that's a little bit about how we did that.
Yeah. So it sounds like part of the survive and thrive model is being able to have backup options, being able to pivot quickly, change quickly, take advantage of new opportunities. Is that part of what's in your book?
A little bit, but I would say that more importantly, it's getting clear on the purpose statement, which is like not the products you offer, but it's I help real people solve a real problem with real solution. And so in our vision for this business, for Cowork Inc., then I recognized that our vision was to help entrepreneurs create thriving businesses. That was it from day one. The co-working space was just a piece of how we did that. But once that co-working space became a non-option, or at least not the best option, we went back to that purpose statement and said, okay, why do we exist? Okay, we help entrepreneurs create thriving businesses. Okay, are there other ways we can do that? Yes, what do entrepreneurs need right now? And so actually the first thing we did was we partnered with a company based out of Chattanooga, Tennessee, that had a curriculum called Rebuild, which they were teaching local business owners how to basically just rebuild their whole business strategy in the midst of the crisis, in the very middle of it. And so we licensed their curriculum because I wrote a book, I've written courses, we could have created our own, but time was of the essence. And I recognized they have something that's working. And so we licensed their curriculum, brought it to our community, got our local business community on board, and we had businesses go through that program. We got sponsors to cover most of the cost of it. So actually most of the small businesses didn't pay very much at all, but some of the businesses who were doing very well locally, because they were on the right side of the economy, could afford to write a check to offset our costs, so we could teach other small business owners how to pivot in the middle of that. So that was, again, it comes back to like, if you get clear on the purpose statement, then you have the ability to pivot, right? It's not just a question of like, how do we rethink the product? It's how do we rethink how we serve what our customers need? Because I love this. Michael Hyatt, who I've worked with for years. I mean, I was on his leadership team for I guess a little over 3 years, and he's the first mentor I interviewed on my podcast. He asked at the beginning of the crisis, when everyone was freaking out, especially a lot of his clients are business owners, and he asked them in his coaching program, he said, well, do your customers have more problems or less problems than they did, before the crisis? Everyone's like, well, yeah, they have more problems. And he's like, well, then you know what to do, because your job as an entrepreneur is to solve problems. And so you just have to figure out the solutions you're going to change in the midst of crisis. But my book's not just about crisis. It's about the fact that honestly, most businesses fail all the time. And how do we change that? How do we refocus on the fundamentals of how your business is built to really just beat the odds?
Mm-hmm. So can you give us some of those highlights, or is there a step-by-step process or a method or a formula that you have? Can you walk us through that real quick?
Oh, I'm happy to. So I've got a playbook that I kind of walk through in the book that also is like a kind of fill in the blank secondary tool. And then there's a Thrive Score assessment that goes with the book too. But it starts with your purpose statement, which I already mentioned, which is I help real people solve real problem with real solutions. You have to have those 3 decisions. Who are your real people? What's the real problem you're trying to solve? And then what's your real solution? But the solution doesn't just mean your product. It's more of a category choice, because then the next thing you need to ask is, what's your growth model? Like, in other words, in business, there are really only 5 growth models. There's different ways, strategies, and tactics within those 5, but you just need to pick one, because you don't need actually 5 different growth models to succeed. You just need one that works really well. And most people most business owners get kind of scattered. They're trying to do a little bit of everything. So instead, I walk through in the book how you pick, first, like, do you want a viral or word of mouth marketing strategy? Is that your growth model? Or perhaps a paid growth strategy? And what does that look like? Which that might be Facebook ads or billboards. I mean, right? Those are still both paid advertising strategies. Is sticky growth your growth model? And those 3, by the way, come from Eric Ries in the book, The Lean Startup. He introduced those 3. To my knowledge, he's the first to kind of identify those. But then I added 2 more that I think that are a little bit different. Sticky growth, by the way, is just like irreplaceable infrastructure. Like, think QuickBooks or whatever accounting software you use. It doesn't really matter if someone hits you with an ad saying, like, buy my accounting software, and you're like, I've got years of history and all my invoices and payrolls tied to QuickBooks. I'm not even looking at the other stuff. So QuickBooks can spend a lot of money on the front end acquiring you as a customer with sales calls and sponsorships of business events and all kinds of stuff that has a low conversion rate, but they're going to keep you forever. And so that's that sticky growth model. The other 2 would be affiliate growth and SEO growth, or search engine optimization. And affiliate growth, you might think, well, wait a second, that's kind of like paid growth. But the biggest difference is with paid growth, you pay before you get results. With affiliate growth, you pay after you get results. And so in the book, I walk through those 5, how to pick the one for you. And then it's a question of what's your free sample, right? Some people might call this your opt-in or your lead magnet, but what's essentially the conversion mechanism that allows someone to give them the first yes in your business. And then you get into your products. And I recommend you have 3 core products: your flagship product, your gateway product, and your continuity product. Because this is like the short version of everything, but that's the end of the framework. So the gateway product is essentially the painless purchase, right? This is someone who's like, they're willing to take a bet on you, but they're not ready to go all in. And maybe they'll buy a $5 or $10 product. Could be digital, could be physical, really depends on your industry. But the goal here is really just to wow them, to give them an easy, painless way to make a purchase and then to exceed their expectations. And that gets them interested in your flagship product, which is more like the full package, the big kahuna, the epitome of everything you offer, which is typically your most expensive product. And that's something that honestly, typically less than 10% of your customers are ever going to buy. But just because they know it's there, it's something to aspire to. You're communicating a vision of what transformation looks like. The continuity product or a subscription product is the glue that holds everything together. It's the automatic customer, as John Warlow calls it, the recurring subscription product. But if you have those 3, you've got a business. Everything else that's not one of those 3, I believe, needs to be either a complementary product or a supplementary product, one of those 3. So it needs to be really just like an add-on. But if you build your business around those 3, you don't have to have 100 products. You don't have to have 100,000 customers, and you can have a thriving business.
That's fantastic. And I know that the book's new. I mean, it's just about to come out as we're recording this. By the time this recording's out, the book will just about be out.
Yes.
But you've already worked with people, it sounds like, on this. Do you have any case studies or any examples of people using this and surviving and thriving in their businesses because of it?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. The playbook, in the detailed way I just shared it, is something that version of it is probably the newest version of this philosophy. So I don't have specific examples tied to that yet. I will, because we're launching this new membership site, and that's the sole focus of it. But I will say all that framework comes out of my experience working with thousands of students when I was the dean of Platform University, as well as interviewing 36 business mentors about what was working in their business, even in the midst of the crisis. So I got to interview some incredible, authors and entrepreneurs like Michael Hyatt, Ray Edwards, Pat Flynn, Mike Michalowicz, and many others in the middle of the lockdown of what was working and not working in their business. And that's really where a lot of those principles came out of, was really just saying, like, looking across the board, not just my own experience, but what's working for my clients, what's working for these people, and then distilling that into a single framework. And so that's where this comes from. I will say it's been pretty cool. It's still early to say, because like business is not something you can just kind of snap your fingers and get the results. So it'll be some time to see all the business results that come from this. But it's been really cool to see just the early reviews and endorsements that have come in. I mean, one reviewer called it a weekend MBA and just said, like, this is everything that they needed that they didn't know in one place. And that's really cool. And I've had so many people tell me that they're already, who had advanced copies of the book, that they've already pre-ordered it for their clients or for, I go to a jiu-jitsu gym, and the head of the franchise just finished the audiobook. He got advanced access to that, just finished the audiobook. And he told me, he's like, everybody in my franchise now, it's a requirement if you're going to run a gym to go through this book, and so that's really cool. So I look forward to coming back with a whole list of case studies.
That's great. Quick break here. Are you an entrepreneur? Do you want to write a book that will help you grow your business? Visit PublishedAuthor.com, where we have programs to fit every budget, programs that will help you write and publish your book in as little as 90 days, starting at just $39 per month. Or, if you're too busy to write your book, we'll interview you and then write and publish your book for you. Don't let the valuable knowledge and experience you have go to waste. Head on over to PublishedAuthor.com to get the help you need to become a published author. You've already waited long enough. Do it today. Now, back to the show. It also sounds like these mentors had a big impact on you. And I think this is an important message for a lot of entrepreneur authors out there, is to realize you don't have to do this on your own. You can turn to people to get information. Can you talk a little bit more about the help that you received from mentors, these business leaders, these other people as you were writing your book?
Sure. Well, the first thing I did was I started to write a first draft that was just me. I mean, it's sort of like, I guess as a first-time author, it was like my assumption was, okay, I need to write a book on my own. And so I'm just going to write my thoughts. And I wrote it out, and it was okay, right? It was okay. But I thought, man, this could be better. But there is this temptation, I think, to just want to write something that's completely original. But that's a lie. I mean, because the reality is everything we know, everything I know, I've learned from working with and learning from so many different people. And so I just reached out to a couple dozen of my mentors and said, and some of them didn't even know they were my mentors, right? I mean, my digital mentors, like I would say most of them probably wouldn't have known they were my mentors. It's more like I read their books, I listen to their podcasts, I follow their blog. And I reached out and said, hey, I'm running a book and I really would love to include your insight in that. Would you be willing to make time for an interview so I could ask you some questions? And I recorded that. And by the way, those were the first, I think, 30 episodes of my podcast, the Thrive School podcast. Each one of those is just one of those interviews. But the podcast wasn't even out yet. I recorded all of those during the lockdown of just like asking them questions about what's going on right now in your business, what's working, what's not working, what have you found to be successful, what advice do you have for other entrepreneurs? And then I went back through and I transcribed all of those. And I went back through and kind of each interview went through the transcription and pulled out a couple paragraphs that I thought really captured really important key concepts. And so I had this massive in Notion, that's what I use to organize my book in the app Notion. I had this massive database basically of all these quotes about and stories. And I had to go through all of them and kind of figure out the pattern. And that's always actually been one of my unique gifts, is just seeing a pattern in the noise. And so I went through all of that and found out, wait a second, okay, he's saying this and he's saying this, but actually that's two versions of this idea. And then I mapped it all out and that ultimately became the book. So most of those people they quoted heavily in the book. And some people like my wife even, at one point she was like, are you worried that like so much of the book is you quoting other people? I mean, there's like huge block quotes in there. I said, no, I'm not, because that's just the truth. Like it's not a curation book. I do write a lot of original content, but there's also entire, half pages, or there's one part where I cite the essay by Kevin Kelly, 1,000 True Fans. And it's like 3 or 4 pages of a chapter is just that essay. And that's just setting my ego aside to say, look, I want to help the entrepreneur and they need to know this. Well, what that's turned into is that a lot of the early reviews coming in specifically say things like, this book now is the only book I recommend, this and The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss are the 2 books I recommend to every entrepreneur. Or someone pointing out, they said, man, I love that John has so many footnotes in his book, because if you want to go deeper in any one of these topics, it's right there. And so no one has said, wait a minute, this is just a bunch of quotes. Like someone will say something like that eventually, and that's fine. I'm not worried about that. But I just included it there. And then I sent them, each of these mentors, I sent them in the mail a signed copy of the book. Many of them now have had me on their podcast to talk about the book, and I just thanked them. I said, hey, thank you this is your book too. I mean, you helped make this possible. Many of them publicly endorsed the book. I mean, the beginning of the book is filled with a couple pages of endorsements from Michael Hyatt and Pat Flynn and Mike Michalowicz and Ray Edwards and Alan Dibb and Casey Graham and Rabbi Daniel Lapin and just so many incredible entrepreneur authors. So, yeah, I mean, we could talk about the publishing process, and you mentioned you might want to talk about that. I also did work with an editor, so there was some of that in there too. But honestly, so much of it came out of the interviews. The book is way better because there's interviews and stories in there from these well-known mentors.
And I think this is a great point, that I think as authors, sometimes we overthink it a bit and we think that the reader is going to be thinking about us. Mm-hmm. Really, they don't care about us as the author. No, they just care about what's in the book for them. Mm-hmm. And so when you're including quotes and these block quotes from other people, all the reader is thinking is, hey, this is great value. This is great stuff. This is helpful. They're not thinking they're not analyzing how the book was written or how much of it is the author versus. They're just, what's in it for me? And if you've got a bunch of great quotes from other people, then that's great stuff for them. Yeah. But as authors, it's so easy to get self-conscious and be like, oh, they expect me to do this and I have to be this way and I have to write it this way. It's like, nobody cares.
Nobody cares. Well, one of my chapters in my book is literally called Prioritize Profit First, which you may know is Mike Michalowicz's framework, Profit First. And I'm a certified Fix This Next advisor. And I sort of loosely know Mike, like we've talked a few times. But I was like, no, I'm not going to create some new financial system. You need to use his. I'm sorry, it's the best. And so I interviewed him about it. And then I cited both the interview and his book. So that chapter is like mostly me explaining his system. But sure enough, that Jeremy, the gentleman I mentioned who owns this whole franchise of jiu-jitsu gyms, he told me, he was like, man, that book was so good. And Profit First, brilliant, right? So he's looking at me saying, you have a whole chapter on somebody else's framework, but he was just so grateful for that because he doesn't care where it came from.
Yep. Now it reminds me of the book Scaling Up by Vern Harnish. That book quotes so many people and it mentions so many other books. And it's one of my favorite books because I love reading books. And so a book that quotes other books and gives me more books to read,
Yeah.
He's just giving me that much more value. And so I don't mind that he mentions 30 or 40 other books. I love it because then it's like, all right, now I know what I'm going to read next. So yeah, tell us a little bit more about the publishing process. So was there ever a thought to self-publish this, or how are you going about it? You said that before we started recording, you mentioned that you're working with a hybrid publisher. How did you come to that decision that you said, I'm going to work with a hybrid publisher? Because you did work with Michael Hyatt, you know people, you probably could have gotten an introduction to a traditional publisher. Why did you decide to go the route that you went?
Yes, Mike McAllowitz specifically actually offered to introduce me to Penguin. He's specific. I don't know. I mean, he didn't say like a specific person to Penguin. He's like, no, I'll introduce you to Penguin. I mean, they might be interested. So yeah, I had the option in front of me of there's really three paths today, right? Do you want to self-publish? Do you want to traditional publish, or do you want some sort of hybrid? And I just had to back up and look at my goals for this book. And I said, you know what? I think that there very may well be a traditionally published book in my future. I think that's probably likely. I considered self-publishing this book. And what I came to was that, I mean, there's a lot of different factors, right? Of course, there's differences in royalties and how complicated it is to get the book out there. If I self-published the book, I probably could have published it about 6 months sooner. But I don't know if it would have been as good. And for me, the two biggest things that a hybrid publisher, and I'm working with Morgan James Publishing, the two things that were most important to me that they provided that I just wouldn't, it's not even that I wouldn't be able to, I just wouldn't do on my own, were one, they have a full-time sales team calling book buyers at traditional bookstores to get them to carry copies of the book. And if I self-published it, I was like, I'm never going to do that. I mean, it's just the truth, right? Could I technically hire someone to do that? Yes. I'm never going to do that. And the second thing is they have a whole team that works on international rights to translate your book in other languages, and with their partners, they have other publishing companies in other countries who partner with them on a regular basis. And I thought, man, how cool would it be for this book to be in other languages? I actually speak Spanish. I could theoretically write this book in Spanish. Am I going to do that? No, there's too many other priorities. And so I viewed that as a huge gift that they were going to focus on that. And it's still too early to say now what international rights will look like, but the plan is that we're going to advocate for international versions of this book in other languages. Now, as a perk, Morgan James also handles the entire, printing and distribution process and SKUs and Ingram and, all the behind the scenes. So really I had to just focus on the content. But honestly, with things like Amazon, KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing, or I think CreateSpace may have been renamed, but whatever, with the whole Amazon side, I know that there's a lot that Amazon could also do for me, but I would be the one, or maybe my assistant would be the one, uploading files, clicking buttons, filling out forms. And I knew that I would get lost in that. It'd be a distraction to me. I wanted to focus as much of my energy as possible on the content, and that being the thing that I uniquely bring to the table. Now, that begs the question, well, then why not traditionally publish? Well, I'm early enough in my career as a first-time author that I was not hopeful that I would get a good book deal. And I've been in the room with other authors who've gotten incredible book deals, and I've been there for that. And so I know what's possible with traditional publishing houses, but I also knew that my email list and my lack of having a previous book were going to be really discounted. They weren't really going to serve me well in that arena. So with a hybrid publisher, I'm giving up some of the royalties. So I told, for an ebook or an audiobook, for example, we split the royalties 50-50 between the publisher and I. After Amazon gets their cut, if it's on Amazon. For international rights, we split it 50-50. I have a friend who had her book translated into, 7 or 8 languages. And when they got to like the first, a South Korean press paid $100,000 to translate the book just for the rights to translate it. Well, that's $50,000 in her pocket, besides the fact that the book is reaching new people in another language, in another country. And so again, it's too early to say if I'm going to have those kind of results with this book. It may not, but that was something that I knew would definitely not happen if I self-published. And I just didn't really feel hopeful about my traditional publishing options. I have a friend who just signed a multi-book deal right now for his first 2 books, and it's a good deal. But him and I were talking about it. He said, if I did what you did, he said, every one of these conversations with these publishers, even with an agent in the room, would have been different. He said, because everyone is going, we like the book, we like your platform, we think it's going to do well, but it's your first time book. And so everyone was discounting their offer because it's his first time. If I sell this book and it does really well, now all of a sudden I can walk in. I mean, I have a client who has sold 50,000 copies of their book that they published through Morgan James. So now when they meet with a publishing house, the publisher's like, oh yeah, sure, whatever you want. I mean, they're writing the terms for the deal at that point.
Yeah. And Morgan James is a great partner. We interviewed David Hancock from their episode number 23 on the Published Author Podcast. So if you're interested, if listeners are interested, they can go listen to that episode to learn more about Morgan James and their hybrid publishing model. But David's a great marketer himself too, which is a rare thing to get with a publisher, because often these publishers, whether they're hybrid or traditional, they kind of leave you on your own for marketing. But David Hancock, he's done guerrilla marketing and all this stuff. So he can really provide assistance in that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, David's great. And I mean, I don't know all the people at Morgan James, but David specifically, and then Karen Anderson, who also sits on the review board and has become a dear friend of mine. You know, the two of them really were influenced my decision to publish. Once I picked a hybrid publisher, I said, well, it's got to be Morgan James because of the people. And it's been good. You know, it's my first time, so I missed a lot of things along the way of like just learning things as I go. So I'm not going to say it was just like easy peasy. You know, like there were definitely things that I missed along the way or bumps in just figuring out the process. But now I know exactly how to do it. In fact, I've already written the second book, but so I'm addicted now.
We'll talk about that in a second, but tell us a little bit more about Survive and Thrive and your marketing launch plan. You're going through this right now. You're getting ready to release the book in just a few days. What have you planned on doing and what's your goal?
So great question. I will say, I'm currently, so today as we're talking is a week away from launch day. It's a week before the actual official publication date of the paperback. Now, normally I would say if I was normally on the interview, I would say we're just a week away from the public release, but because we're talking about published author stuff, I'll tell you some behind the scenes. We've already released the ebook. In fact, we released the ebook in March and we kind of positioned it as like an early release of just, we want to get this ebook into the hands of as many entrepreneurs as possible. And I actually wrote in my journal that morning, the morning of like March 2nd, when we were about to release the ebook, I wrote, you need to remember, you know, I'm not doing this for bestseller status, right? I'm doing this because I want to get this into the hands of entrepreneurs who need it to genuinely help, but I don't want to hold back and wait a few more months to do that. Well, in all irony, the book hit #1 bestseller in direct marketing on Amazon on day one and stayed there for a couple of weeks. And so the book's not technically out yet, and it's already a #1 bestseller, which is kind of confusing to some people. Like at my friends, like we're doing an actual like local book launch party next week and we invite some friends to it. And one of them, he's like, yeah, I'll be there, but I guess I'm confused. I really thought your book already came out. I was like, yeah, that's fair. That's a little confusing, you know, especially if you know me personally and we've talked about it. But that served, I mean, that's huge credibility. It's also a confidence boost going into the paperback release that I genuinely hope it does really well, but also it's already a #1 bestseller. You know what I mean? Like we've already got that screenshot. So that's kind of where we're at there. I've been focusing primarily on podcast interviews like this one as my primary way to get the word out. You know, it's sort of like a speaking tour for an author today where I can do it from my computer. And so I've recorded, I think a few dozen, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but you know, probably more than 30 interviews now on different podcasts. And I had my target list and you know, I've still got some that are scheduled to come out after the book release date, you know, into August and September. So, you know, this is meant to kickstart the launch of the book, but not to be the end of it. To my own email list. And then also every time I talk about the book on podcasts, I also promote that there's pre-order bonuses. Of course, I usually find out when the episode's coming out. So for example, I know we're talking after the book comes out. And so I might change my language. But if the podcast was going to come out before the book comes out, then I would tell everyone, hey, go to surviveandthrivebook.com and you can actually pre-order the book and get $129 in bonuses. If you pre-order the paperback, you get the ebook and the audiobook for free, but you also get an online course called Built to Thrive, which goes deeper into a lot of the concepts in the book. And we're going to charge for that. It's $100 normally, but you're going to get it for free if you pre-order the book. So that's kind of just like the standard pitch for the book that I've given up until now. Yeah.
So some great incentives there to pre-order the book. And do you do any incentives around pre-ordering in bulk?
No, and perhaps I should. Like, there's a note on my sales page that says that if you reach, you know, if you're interested in buying 10 or more, like email me. No one's done that. So I don't know. You know, I think. Yeah, and maybe I should have. I think for me, that was probably like on the front end of this, I was thinking, well, this is really meant for like an entrepreneur. So like you wouldn't like buy it for your team unless you want them to all quit. So that was my initial thinking going into it. But in hindsight, maybe I should have done that. But at this point, I've just stayed the course in this plan. I will say one thing that I did just a couple weeks ago that's done really well is I ran, and I've done press releases before, never been impressed, but I used ereleases.com this time, and I had a different strategy for the press release. And Morgan James actually wrote the press release, and I kind of tweaked a few things like the headline. But we sent it out over e-releases, and the press release for my book got featured on Business Insider, Market Watch, Yahoo Finance. It literally, I'm not exaggerating, literally, and 100 other media outlets, just press release for the book.
That's great. So erelease.com, is that?
Is it e-release or e-releases? Let me see. It's one or the other. Yeah, ereleases.com.
Ereleases.com.
And I've used other PR services, never been impressed, but a friend of mine recommended this one, and I now recommend it as well.
That's great. Have you seen any, I know it's hard to track results from the press releases sometimes. I mean, you see the results in that it gets into the publications, but in terms of book sales, but did you see any sort of bump from that? Or is there anything that you can track back to that definitively to say, hey, this really worked?
It's definitely booked a few interviews. Like I've had people reach out because of the press release. I'm getting interviewed in Basil and Salt magazine, which is basically a gourmet food magazine. So that one, I'm still not sure exactly how that's going to tie into the book, but we'll figure that out. But I will say that this has been the hardest part of working with a hybrid publisher versus self-publishing is I don't have live access to most of the results. Like I have to basically email the author relations team, and they have to then talk to Amazon and find out kind of where things are at. So usually there's like a long delay in terms of when I find out like how many pre-orders or orders we have and that kind of stuff. So no, it's a short version of that, other than I saw an uptick in people who pre-ordered the book just because they're claiming the bonus and joining my email list by doing so. And I had people reach out and email, several people reach out to schedule interviews. And I got to put a couple new logos on the front page of my website. You know, Business Insider and Market Watch and Yahoo Finance are huge credibility for me. So I will say Karen Anderson, who's one of the she's on the pub board for Morgan James. She told me on the front end, she said media creates buzz, but doesn't drive sales in their experience. And so it's a great talking point. It's a great credibility factor. I'm now talking to Business Insider, to their editorial team, about featuring an excerpt of my book on their website. And I think that's a little bit easier because they've already featured the press release for my book on their website. But not tangible number. I don't have a number of books traced back to that press release.
Yeah, but no, those are real results. I mean, getting the interviews, getting the media exposure, getting those badges to put on your website. I mean, that's real stuff. And
that's what I wanted.
Yeah. And you can look at that and say it's just buzz, but it's credibility. And that does lead to sales, because then people go and they see the book or they see your website and they say, well, gee, this guy's in all these places. He must know what he's talking about. And then people are more likely to buy the book and apply it. And that's exactly what we want, right?
Yeah.
All right. So tell us about the next book that you're working on.
Okay. So it's actually already done. And I haven't decided yet how I'm going to publish that one. Honestly, I'm trying to focus on this book, right? To get to the launch and then kind of go back to the drawing board and say, okay, what am I doing here? And I already in my head have the outline for the third book. So I guess I'm addicted now, like I said. But my other book, it's called Always Be Teaching, 50 Illustrated Insights on How to Grow Your Business by Creating Content Online. And it's an illustrated book. And it more focuses on like specifically the content creator economy. And Survive and Thrive, I will say just behind the scenes, Survive and Thrive is sort of like the top of the funnel or the gateway product for my Co-work Inc. business, right? Where we have the Thrive School podcast, the Thrive School Pro membership. That's all related. That's all related to Survive and Thrive. Always Be Teaching is more related to Notable. You know, it's more like, how do you build a business by creating content online? Oh yeah, by the way, you're going to need Notable press. And so I'm never looking at the book as the main revenue generator. For me, it's a top of the funnel kind of lead generator for everything else I'm doing. So that's where Always Be Teaching is a natural extension to say, okay, well, the company needs one of these books now. That's kind of like the anchor book. And so that's done. It's actually on my website. So if you go to johnmeese.com, you can find it. You can just buy it there, but it's not anywhere else, really, just because I didn't want to confuse anybody with the launch of this book. You know, like I haven't put it on Amazon or gone back to Morgan James and worked out a deal for that book, or talked to a traditional publisher about it. That one's a beautiful illustrated book. So I haven't figured out how to do that yet because I haven't spent time on it. But what I really want to do is create like a beautiful kind of like coffee table style, like hardcover book. It'd be more of something you want to keep around. So that's that book. And then my third book will probably be an extension of Survive and Thrive that will be 100% focused on case studies. and it'll probably be called Built to Thrive. And it will be, at least that's the placeholder name. And it will teach the 2.0 version of this framework through the lens of stories of people who've applied it to their business. So that's the multi-year book plan.
Great. That's a well thought out plan.
Thank you. I'm also meeting with a guy named Timmy Bauer, I think his name is, in a couple of weeks, because he has a company called Dinosaur House where they take business books. They work with authors who write business books and they transform them into illustrated kids books. And so we have a couple books that his company's put out, like, I want to start a podcast when I grow up, or so you want to be an entrepreneur. Lucas the dinosaur, says he wants to be the entrepreneur. So that may happen too. We'll see.
That's cool. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, John, this has been great talking to you. If people want to reach out and connect with you, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, johnmeese.com is my website, so you can find all my stuff there. If you're interested in the book, I will say most of the bonuses I mentioned as pre-order bonuses, you're still going to be able to get after the book comes out. So go to surviveandthrivebook.com, get a copy. I hope it's helpful. But then I'm also on LinkedIn. It's literally the only social media platform I'm on. We didn't really get into the writing process too much, but I literally got off all social media to write this book because I've talked about it for years. I got off all social media. I literally got the free write, which is this huge modern typewriter with like an e-ink display and, clackety clack, big keys. So I could write offline because there's just too many distractions online. But now I'm back on LinkedIn. That's the only platform I'm on, but you can go to meese.link actually to find me. That'll take you to my LinkedIn profile if you want to connect. Perfect.
And Meese is Meese, just like geese.
Correct.
And yeah.
Thank you, Josh.
John, thank you so much for being with us today on the Published Author Podcast.
It was my pleasure. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to spread the word, please give us a 5-star rating review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you listen to podcasts. And if you're an entrepreneur interested in writing and publishing a nonfiction book to grow your business and make an impact, visit publishedauthor.com for show notes for this podcast and other free resources.